If I walked into a room of 100 people and said, how many of you are gamers? Maybe 5 people will put their hand up. But if I said, hey, how many of you all played games this morning in some capacity? Probably 90 of those people are going to raise their hands. And if you have an audience, quite literally, that has a mobile device, you are talking to somebody who plays games.
Being authentic in the way that brands interact has to be really, really important. How do you help your clients maintain that level of authenticity?
That's another thing that I think brands tend to overthink, is that
Today, we're going to talk to Josh Knapp. Josh is Senior Vice President of Brand Partnerships for Super League. We're going to talk to Josh today about the immersive experience involved in gaming and how brands can play a role in that. In particular, we'll focus on how brands need to keep player-centric as they try to get involved in these immersive experiences. That's the way that brands really contribute and don't take away from what they're trying to accomplish. We're also going to talk about the importance of moving away from funnel thinking and moving toward more holistic experience thinking. By thinking along the lines of the experience, we see how we're affecting people, impacting them, helping them to improve their intent to purchase. And then finally, we're going to talk about how brands can get into these kinds of experiences by having a very MVP approach to help them dip their toes in immersive gaming. We're excited to be talking to Josh today. Let's get started. Josh, thank you so much for buying out some time to join us today. Very happy and excited to have you on the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much, Shamir. I'm really excited to be here. Excited to have a good conversation.
And one of the things that really made me look forward in particular to this episode is that we're talking to an organization that does something a little bit different than kind of what we usually talk to. There are obviously moments where we talk directly to kind of enterprise companies, nonprofit organizations. There are times where we kind of talk to the more traditional kind of digital marketing agency to get their perspective on things. But what you do is a bit more unique in that sense. I'd love it for you to take a second to talk a little bit about what Super League is, what you do there. And in particular, one of the things that the phrase that you used before is that you help brands become playable. And I'd love for you to talk about what that actually means.
No, absolutely. And I mean, in short, our tagline is, Super League helps make brands playable. We sit on the cutting edge of what it means to be in and around immersive media from a digital marketing and advertising standpoint. That sits at an interesting juxtaposition in and around the gaming world, primarily focused in areas on open platform worlds such as Fortnite or Roblox or Minecraft, as well as playing very strongly in the mobile app video game space as well. And again, when we say we make brands playable, it's really about being additive to what folks are doing. It's about creating an element where they're already leaned in and they're already engaged. And when you are interacting with something and playing with something, your engagement and your interest is piqued significantly, and you're along and a part of that experience, as opposed to a traditional ad model where you're just trying to get someone's attention. This is an area where attention already exists, and by making brands playable, drives significant results for our clients, and frankly makes them fun. And when people are having fun, they have a better experience.
We talk here on the podcast about the digital customer experience and kind of what that means. And this is a very unique aspect of that digital customer experience. This isn't the direct kind of e-storefront that perhaps some people think about, or maybe some other kind of kiosk or some other element of that experience. This is very different in that you're really helping brands kind of play and create a more maybe implicit interaction with customers as you mentioned, kind of engage in helping brands get activated in kind of that gaming space that takes place. Has brands talked to you and try to figure out how best to do that? What kind of separates the successful activation engagements in that immersive experience from those that aren't very successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, there's a mixed bag of answers probably there, but I think the reality is understanding there's a different nuance, there's a different tonality, there's a different just level of interaction that exists when you're in and around gaming. So when brands approach it, understanding that it is not in a traditional model, it is not a traditional ad campaign, and they understand that things need to be player first, I think is the best way to think about it, and that the players expect to be a part of the conversation as opposed to talked to or advertised at. It's not that people are averse to being advertised in and around gaming. It's that they want to make sure that it is a part of something that they're already doing. So if brands approach this from the right way and being a part of the conversation, providing some additional utility, some additional additive aspect, that's really when brands win. And that's a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about, to clients and prospective clients and clients that are looking to renew and iterate on things that have happened and performed well in the past is how do you take it to the next level? How do you iterate into something that again is additive but reflective of the community and the values that a player already exists? When a brand just wants to come in and talk about their brand and make sure that their messaging gets across, like that's where some challenges, come into play.
It makes me think of a couple of different questions. I guess as we talk about that, a brand approaches you, they want to engage, they want to get involved in an immersive experience. How big of a consideration is it to say, okay, brand, what do you represent? What are you about? And what space, right? What game or an environment best aligns with you and kind of what you represent from a brand standpoint? Is that kind of an initial part of that kind of figuring out what's going to be the best experience for that brand to be able to kind of be a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hugely important part of the conversation, and that is, I always say when you're talking to a brand, that may have activated in the space before and may have no idea, the questions really start with, why do you want to do this? Talk to me a bit about who your audience is. Talk to me about ultimately what is going to define success for you. Based on some of those answers and kind of familiarity, brand comfort levels, things like that, will help determine and inform what something should be, how you should approach that. It may dictate which platform, and that may be, a brand might have a preconceived notion of like, hey, I want to be on X platform, when depending on what the actual outcome that defines success for them and or what their audience is, that may not be the best case scenario. I think that the other question is, really about how do they want to be seen and how do they want to show up? Is this something that would be beneficial for the audience to be more evergreen? Would it be beneficial for the brand for it to be evergreen? Or is this tied to some sort of a marketing campaign, a brand launch, a product launch type of a situation that is more of like a marketing event? Those help dictate how a brand would see success when they activate.
All right. So I'm kind of hearing, and probably more than this, but I'm kind of boiling it down to kind of three things, right? So first of all, is there some level of alignment between the brand and maybe the gaming experience they're looking to be a part of, right? Once you kind of figure it out, it's like, okay, great. What's the goal of why you're even doing this in the first place? And that's also going to affect the level of alignment with perhaps the environment that you're going to be a part of. But it's also going to, kind of impact, well, how do we do this, right? And then kind of finally, okay, great. Now that we understand there's alignment, now that we understand your goals, what you're trying to do, how should you be a part of that experience? What role are you going to play in that experience? So I think we kind of covered those first parts, very well in terms of, okay, let's talk about alignment. Let's talk about your goals. Is this a launch? Is this something more evergreen? Now, how are you helping, a little bit more detailed, how are you helping brands kind of walk through the way in which they actually become a part of that experience?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, look, I think it's core root. We're talking about, again, being playable and talking about, things that are in and around gaming. Like, it should be fun. That's really where it starts. When, the term gamer, right, comes across all the time. And the reality is, like, what's that mean? That means something different to everyone. At the core root, it's people, and people interact with games multiple times every single day to the point where it's become part of your subconscious. You don't even realize it, right? And so to your question, it's like, how do you do that? It's like, okay, part of that depends on who your audience target is, right? And how that specific audience segment may be interacting with games that will help determine which platform it ends up being on. And then it's like, okay, now that we've said we're going to be on one platform, these are some best practices. So as an example, right, if we were going to have a brand and the audience aligns with Roblox as an example, right, we want to lean in to for a brand to activate, you want to lean into the social aspect, the community. It's very, very short, sticky game loops that are, somewhat repetitive, and there's a lot of personal style that goes into that, whether it's with virtual items and the terminology is UGC because anybody can come in and create a virtual item. A lot of brands do that as well. And there's some good tangible crossover. Whereas if you were going to talk about Minecraft, that is much more of kind of an open thinking build experience, right? It's for, a lot of creativity comes into play there because the core aspect of that gameplay loop is building and creating things, right? So it's inherently different, than Roblox. And just while we're on the topic of those, I'll throw Fortnite in there. That's much more of like a cinematic journey, really high res imagery, gameplay. There's a bit of a storyline that goes into things. There's still a community aspect, but it's a bit less prominent than Roblox is. You're still going and hanging out and playing with friends. And so like each one of them is a little bit different. And then the gameplay mechanisms, tend to be a little bit different as well. And so like that's kind of how you approach it once you determine kind of those first two buckets that you described.
Is this a situation where, brands obviously have a very strong idea of perhaps, what kind of audience that they're looking for when they come to these platforms. And I'm wondering how much of that is or isn't misconception, right? So someone may come and say, well, I'm talking to teens, right? Like that's the audience I'm trying to get to. And conversely, a brand may come and say, well, I'm not talking to teens. I'm not talking to young people. So I have no business doing any of these immersive experiences. Are those misconceptions that you guys have to kind of work through?
Absolutely. And I think that happens literally on probably an hourly basis, right? When we're talking to clients. I mean, that happens when, I'm talking to friends and family and other colleagues as well, and it's there's been a lot of really good conversation, I think, recently in the industry around just what this, these kind of misperceptions are. Right. And I think the reality is there still is this, kind of predetermined notion. I used the term gamer before, right? That's a little bit of like a taboo name, like within the industry, because like, what does that exactly mean? That means something different to everyone. If I walked into a room of 100 people and said, how many of you are gamers? Maybe 5 people will put their hand up. But if I said, hey, how many of you all played games this morning in some capacity? Probably 90 of those people are going to raise their hands. And out of the 10 that didn't, most of them some of them may not be being fully honest with themselves, right? And so the perception around like what these things are and then therefore what platforms or what their audience is, like if you have an audience quite literally that has a mobile device, you are talking to somebody who plays games. Now, how they interact with them, which games they play, what platforms they're on varies, right? But, if you're talking to, an audience who is 50 plus, they're definitely playing games on their mobile device. They're playing different games than someone who's 15 are playing on their mobile device. And so that varies a little bit and their interaction and their reasons for doing it, differ. But like, yeah, I think that so much of what we do and how we talk to brands and part of the ongoing, frankly, one of the things that I love so much about what I do is it's an ongoing education, right? And that education evolves constantly as well, right? As new trends come out, as new things are happening in pop culture. And I think a lot of brands are like, oh, we don't have a gaming audience, or, that doesn't fit for my brand. That to me, is just a lack of understanding of exactly who their audience is. Because look, I mean, if you're talking about the current youth who are in grade school or middle school or high school, let alone getting into college, which is kind of where I think most people think that kind of 18 to 24 audience is who the gamer is. Kids are learning via games on a daily basis in school, like school sanctioned things. Adults are playing games on their phone when they're commuting, or when they're bored and they're trying to pass the time. And so, like, understanding that aspect, I think, is a really important part of it. And then it starts to get into, like, hey, what makes sense on each platform, and who that audience is. But yeah, I mean, I think that misperception is just that education is just really, it's really fun to be a part of. And it's really fun, like, once you start unpacking a little bit, brands are like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. Like I said, I mean, it's saying that you don't have a gaming audience, or you know who you're trying to market to doesn't resonate with them. That's kind of like saying, okay, my audience doesn't go to the movies, right? Or my audience doesn't stream, TV. They don't watch Netflix. Like, everybody does all of these things, and so that the more brands understand and lean into that, I think the easier that conversation becomes. But going back to the beginning, like, yeah, happens multiple times a day.
I can imagine, it's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking about, the games I play on my phone. And, I'm thinking about, I'm a bit of a geek. So I play, New York Times crossword puzzle, Reddit. And I'm playing my crossword puzzle. And it's funny, you pick up patterns in the crossword puzzle, like certain questions they ask, you begin to learn, like, okay, this is the answer they're looking for. And I'm thinking of, like, for example, and I'm not going to name the exact brand, but I'm thinking there's always a question they ask of, like, this is a well-known luxury hotel. And, it's like, oh, okay, I know what they're talking about. This is the answer they want, right? And I'm not saying that's an example of what you do per se, but in principle, right? It's a way of saying, hey, you're integrating this brand into the game in a very kind of natural, reasonable way, and you're kind of subconsciously helping me associate this particular brand with the fact that they're a luxury hotel, and and that's kind of there, right? And that's implanted in me. And here I am not, the generation that someone might, outwardly consider to be a gamer per se, again, to kind of fit that stereotype, so to speak. But because I do interact with games, by nature, there's opportunities for me to therefore interact with brands in very natural ways. And I mentioned, and I think you used this word earlier, being authentic in the way that brands interact has to be really, really important. Um, how do you help your clients maintain that level of authenticity so that it does feel natural? It just feels like, okay, I'm doing their crossword puzzle and I see this. Okay, they're asking for this brand name. Okay, yeah, that's the answer, and I kind of move on. How do you keep it very smooth so that there is that level of, again, implicit brand engagement without it being something that's like beating me over the head?
No, it's a great question. And I mean, authenticity, being authentic, like, that is such a buzzword, right, as it relates to any form of marketing or advertising. And there are a lot of different interpretations to it. And I think when it comes to, and this is the case for a lot of different media activations, right? But it's about being understanding that brand is a part of the conversation, right? And having the self-awareness as a brand to say that, like, this person isn't here because of me as a brand, or us as a brand, I guess, if you want to use it that way. They're here because this is a thing that they do and they're choosing to do, and therefore it should be a choice for them to interact with our brand. Our brand is here and we want it to be interesting, but we wanted it to be additive, right? We wanted it to be a reward. We want them to choose to spend time with us outside of, like, waving a flashy, piece of creative or commercial or whatever it is, or display banner that is, jumping all over the screen and saying, hey, here, pay attention to me. It's about being player first, right? And it's about being, whoever that specific target audience is that you're interacting with in this playable environment, understanding that like they're first. So anything that you do should be additive to what they're already doing, because that's when the real magic starts to happen, right? That's when brands are like exactly what you just described. Hey, they're not overtly branding, right? However, I'm now making this association that like, hey, I just got to go and check something out that was pretty cool. I got rewarded for it, or I earned this new free item, or it helped me, advance in the game that I was already playing. And that creates a positive, fun experience that if you're doing it the right way, and it's kind of that aspect of being kind of a sticky game loop, as I like to call it, like they're going to come back and check it out again. They're probably going to go tell their friends, because I did this really cool thing. You should go and check it out too. And that's when things really start to take on a life of their own. And when a brand does it the right way, the community reacts and applauds, and I think that when things become brand first, it's an understandable angle that I think marketers want to go. If done incorrectly, it creates quite the opposite effect of brands really applauding and leaning into things. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just an overall good thing to continue to be reminded of. Right. Is when it means to be authentic, it's, being a part of the conversation. You are not the conversation, in understanding that brand is not why that consumer is there. That's really what it comes down to.
And I like the way you said that, because, as marketers, it's easy to say that we're customer centric, we're player centric, right? That's a bit of a buzzword in and of itself, but actually kind of having the rubber hit the road and actually doing that in practice is something often completely different. So you hear brands talk about that, but then they don't actually follow through in terms of the way that they run their campaigns, or they manage their digital product, or whatever the case may be. And I think probably in the world that you're operating in, again, it's one thing to say, "Oh yeah, that makes complete sense. Yeah, we definitely want to be player centric." But at the same time, I think people kind of come in the door having the idea of kind of like, the product placement in a TV show or a movie, where the main actor in this particular scene is sitting there kind of holding up this bottle of Coke, and he makes, and making sure that the logo is turned towards you as he's drinking the Coke and saying this scene, and it becomes like this cheesy thing where it's like, okay, like I get it, Coke paid you guys, like he has to drink Coke or she has to drink, like I get it, right? So obviously that's what you're trying to avoid, right? You don't want to come off like that in any way, form, or fashion. That's where you're trying to get brands away from. And you're trying to get them to say, hey, look, there's a more natural way to kind of fall into place here that's going to leave a more positive perception with the player. It's not going to beat them over the head, so to speak, with the brand, but it's going to leave them with a perception of the brand on a high note. So I wonder, because it's something that's going to be more, and maybe this isn't the right word, but because it's something that's going to be more subtle, right, and not necessarily so kind of direct. Again, it's not going to be the dancing banner across the screen. How are you guys kind of measuring and helping brands to understand, hey, this is the impact it's having, right? Because it's like, well, now this comes down to metrics. Like, we've spent money to do this, right? How are we understanding it's happening? And maybe even it comes to a conversation where it's like, convince me that this is working, because I'm not seeing, actor A, B, or C take my can of Coke or bottle of Coke and drink it and make sure that the logo is turned toward the screen, right? And because it's not that necessarily overt, and it's not beating me over the head, how are you convincing me that this more authentic, subtle approach is working?
No, I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, I think that you said it, really well, this kind of overt aspect of branding. I mean, like, let's call it what it is. We are so in touch with, consuming various forms of media in whatever way is comfortable for you. Advertising is everywhere. And, going even back to that buzzword of authentic, like, people see through that. They can sniff out when something is overt branding, and or, even if it's talent or an influencer or something like that, are taking a check, so to speak, right? And so, doing those things, in the right way. And again, going back to it and being additive, what it comes down to from a measurement perspective is like, yeah, you want awareness, right? You want reach. That's great. And you start to think about things a little bit differently as it relates to like, this isn't just impressions, right? We're not just talking about clicks. I mean, we can get into that real technical aspect of things because a lot of these platforms don't allow you to click, right? And so from a measurement perspective, I think a lot of what we talk about are things like brand affinity, right? Overall lift, purchase intent, um, but I think really where I would love to see the industry going, certainly something as part of my mission, but part of the ongoing education aspect is brands to get away from measuring what success is by sheer clicks and click through rate or VCR or base level impressions, right? From an overall marketing perspective. Start talking about having the conversation and adjusting it to an engagement first metric, right? That's kind of already there if you think about it from a social media perspective and how people really measure if a post was successful, be it branded or organic, is the engagement rate that is in there. Like that is a metric that you can tangibly glean from any form of gaming. It's a little nuanced by platform, but if somebody is there, if they're choosing to interact, if you have a 3D character that is there that somebody is going to talk about and interact with, or a game that you have created, or an item that you've created, people are interacting with that, right? And so that engagement to me is much more impactful to measure what success is versus how many impressions that I get, how many clicks that I get, because that doesn't always tell the full story. It is what is commonplace, and I think what a lot of the industry is still kind of chained to, right? And because it's what they're comfortable with. But yeah, I think engagement is really that aspect that I would love to see more people lean into, because when you think about the aspect of engagement, like that's where you can start equating things into like more tangible, I think, ROI versus if you are spending the same amount, if you're spending the same $100,000 in and around a game where your engagement rate is through the roof versus a display banner where you're measuring engagement by clicks that may be erroneous, outside of people choosing to do something, like that's a really powerful piece of measurement from an ROI perspective on where that can go.
I'm a big believer in the fact that as marketers, we need to stop kind of using the term funnel and start using the word experience more often, because that's really what it is. In our day and age, as you kind of mentioned, there are so many touch points that people interact with, often before they actually make the decision to actually purchase from a brand. It is not this linear thing that we like to imagine it is, where someone goes to some random news site, sees a banner, clicks on the banner, goes to the website, looks at the product, says, "Oh, this is great," goes to checkout, puts in their credit card and buys. Like that's not what happens. I mean, and it's funny because we say that, like we talk about that as marketers, like that's not what happens. But then the way that we measure things is as if that's what's happening.
That's right. That's why I left.
Right. And it's just like, well, that's ridiculous, right? And it's just like, now, did the banner play a role? Probably. But the banner played a role, and the website played a role, and emails that you sent to follow up played a role. And, even the billboard that you sent played a role. And if you're a brick and mortar, the last time you drove by the store played a role or went in the store. And if you're a gamer and that brand, and there was some aspect of that brand experience that played a role, right? Your overall experience with the brand is what is influencing the actual purchase. And more importantly, arguably, what happens after the purchase, which is the retention and the loyalty that person has to the brand, right? To drive lifetime value, right? It's all these touch points all kind of working together. And the best brands are the ones that really clean that up and get that really into alignment, so that no matter where I'm touching and interacting with the brand, it's always singing the same song. I'm always hearing the same thing. It's reinforcing the thought, and it's helping me get this positive perception, right? It's the same reason that that CPG brands spend so much money on commercials, not because they think I'm going to see Crest toothpaste on a commercial and be like, I need to go to the grocery store right now and buy some Crest toothpaste, right? It's because they want you to have the perception so that when 2 weeks from now you're at the grocery store, right?
When you do need it, that's the brand you're going to get. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. And that's exactly, the game, no pun intended, that you guys are playing, right? You're trying to make sure that brands are creating this positive perception in the marketplace across a person's experience, in this case, across these immersive gaming experiences, so that that perception can help influence intent, their perception, their awareness, the integrity they have, and affinity they have for the brand to move them through the process. And I think it's a beautiful way to do it because, again, you're very nicely helping brands inject themselves into a place where people already are, where they're already having an experience, and arguably a positive experience because people are returning to these games, right? You're playing your same games every single day. They're already having a positive experience. How do we layer the brand in there in a way that doesn't feel forced, but that makes sense? And then that feeds off that positive experience and then ultimately kind of drives them to purchase.
You make a really good point, and you use the terminology that like brands need to be activating, regardless of what they're doing, in like a cohesive effort. Like their messaging should be similar. And I think that is also going back to the perception versus reality part of the conversation. That's another thing that I think brands tend to overthink, is that they're like, oh, well, I'm going to do something in gaming. Well, I need to be specific to a gamer, and like that, therefore our messaging should be different. I'm not saying that, you shouldn't alter it at all, because you're definitely going to alter your message in some capacity, but it should be complementary to anything else that you're doing, so that experience, regardless of whether you can, consume it as a brick and mortar, a digital display banner, or an in-game experience, like, should have some continuity through it. And I think that too often they're like, well, we need to create this whole campaign. And it's just simply not the case. And I think that's where things can get a little wonky.
Marketers we often get too cute for our own good, instead of just like, like we're making this more complicated than it needs to be. People don't like complicated. They like easy. Like our job as marketers is to make this as straightforward and simple as possible for people. Like that's simple communication, simple message. Like let's boil this down so that people don't have to spend the cognitive load to have to kind of like, to deconstruct this, to get this complex message, diluted, right? Let's dilute it for them so that they're able to, get through this very smoothly and very easily. But before I go on my sandbox about that, that whole tirade, let me ask you this, Josh. As you think about maybe legacy brands who maybe are thinking about this, or maybe even they're not thinking about this yet, but can benefit from this. For our listeners who maybe are enterprise leaders at some of these legacy brands, how can they get started? Like how can they kind of, for lack of a better way to kind of analogize it, to illustrate it, how can they kind of dip their toe into the world of gaming and immersive and leveraging that for the purpose of their brand?
No, I mean, it's a great question, and a great segue, because you just made a comment a moment ago about, everyone likes to kind of keep things simple, right? And you don't want it to be this really complex type of a situation. Like that's the same thing with gaming, and I think it ties really well into, again, the perception versus reality and the aspect of education, because I think a lot of legacy brands don't know what they don't know. And they know that they don't know things, but they're risk averse, and they're like, this sounds like something that we don't know enough about, so we're better off just staying away from it. And I think that is probably the biggest pitfall that you see, because I think the biggest risk in not leaning into an audience that again is anyone that has a mobile phone, in and around gaming, the biggest risk is doing nothing, right? It's doing nothing. And so I think part of that education, and to your question, is like, how do you take a crawl, walk, run approach with things, right? What are you comfortable with? This is going to be different for every brand, right? What is your comfort level as it relates to, your brand safety? What is your comfort level as it relates to, having your IP show up in different places? Because some brands are like, well, I don't want my IP there without someone paying me for my IP to be on this platform. And it's like, that's That's not really the way that it works. I totally respect those who do that because there are people who think that way. But I think, that aspect of, again, crawl, walk, and run, it's like, okay, what are you doing? Right. And I think that when you activate with this audience in and around gaming, it doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to take a significant amount of time, effort, resource, both from manpower and a monetary perspective, which I think a lot of legacy brands think that it does because what they're accustomed to, and understandably so, I think, from a gaming perspective, is like the aspect of, AAA gaming, console gaming, and things needing to take, months, years in some capacity. I won't even get into a Grand Theft Auto perspective because it's still not here, right? An on again, off again scenario. Like it'll take months, if not years, to develop a game and roll it out with this huge strategy. And some brands have gotten really good with it. You have the recurring themes like Madden as an example that they're consistently, NBA 2K, the sports titles that are consistently renewing itself. Call of Duty is another one. But like, for a brand to get involved in that, they think it's going to take a long time and it's got to be really complicated and they have to come up with a completely different strategy. And a lot of what we talk about is like, that's not necessarily the case. Like, are you running video? If you're running, because the answer is yes, everybody's running video in some capacity. Like, you can do that on platforms like Minecraft or Roblox. You 1,000% can do that in and around mobile gaming, right? And app-based games. And so it's creating these ease of entry and breaking down barriers of like, hey, let's just talk about like-to-like media products. Your audience is here already. And this is an area that you haven't necessarily touched. And it's like, okay, that's how you're dipping your toe in because it's a like-to-like scenario that the clients understand, right? That the creative teams understand. They're already creating assets for this. And that frankly, an agency of record, a media agency of record also is tasked with, these sorts of performance and activation metrics that they're already doing across the board. So it creates this ease of entry to like dip your toe in the water, do some like-to-like media products, but that can also extend into things like creating a 3D character. If you have a mascot, if you have some sort of IP that warrants that, like you can create a generic one that, might resonate even better with consumers depending on what it is that you decide to come up with, because we're talking about making things fun and playable in a game environment. Like that's the whole point. You can create a 3D character. You can dabble in like little mini games, short sticky game loops. That can be an app-based game. It can be in one of the open platforms, and insert a brand in a subtle, unique and non-overt way that a brand will start to they'll start to have interaction with that audience. And it's like, okay, cool. What's working? What's resonating? What might we need to tweak? But it's not a significant amount of time, effort, or investment to do those sorts of things. And that's, I think, really the best way to have brands dip a toe is to not think that they have to go in and build an entire game or do a deep level integration, build their own world. You can do that. And when done right, they certainly resonate really, really well. But I mean, I think more often than not, if they're going to spend the resource, and time and effort that goes into building your own world, then all of a sudden you start to go back into that, the pendulum starts to swing back into like, oh, well, then it needs to be inherently ours. And then it tends to start to get overbranded and you're not thinking about it from a player first perspective. And that's when things can get a little left. So yeah, I think it's like that crawl, walk, run approach. It's like, what's an easy like scenario? You can do that in and around gaming, get the experience, get the comfort level, and then start to build and grow on that and have it be an iteration. Because again, like you want to be a part of the game, and you want to be a part of that experience that consumer/player is also having with the game and therefore with your brand.
So it's really that MVP mentality, right? Like there's an entry point, right? There's a way to get into this without having to be this massive investment, right? This complicated thing, and for you to be able to get kind of a feel for it, and then from there to learn and say, how do we kind of steer this ship through these kinds of experiences in a way that makes the most sense for our brand. So that makes complete sense. Josh, thank you so, so much for your time today. Really educational for myself and I'm sure for our audience. And I really appreciate you being able to be on with us.
No, it is my absolute pleasure. Like I said, this is the sort of conversation I love to have and consistently are having on a normal basis. So yeah, excited to be a part of it. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to seeing what's next with you all.